Asalamualaikum guys, welcome to tutorial number 8. In this video we'll be going over the next control flow statement, while loops. So a while loop is sort of a cousin to a for loop, where it also repeats execution of code, however its condition works a bit differently than for loops. If you watched tutorial number 7, we discussed on for loops and how their conditions contain iterables like the range function. And we used a counter variable that goes through the range of items in the iterable. For example, we had for I in range 10, which can print out code in your for loop 10 times for each number in the range. In the case of while loops, their conditions are not defined by iterables. They simply take in a true or false condition with a specified counter. So I've set up the loop here saying while I is less than 10, with I being the counter variable here with a value 0. So for every iteration in this while loop, the counter I will be printed out first here, then I's value will be added by 1. This new counter value will then be used in the next iteration, and then going about the same onwards. When I run the program, you'll see our numbers 0 up to 9 printed out to the console. Alright, so what's going on here? Well, let's start with the first iteration. The I value 0 will be read in the condition as 0 is less than 10, which is true, and it therefore executes the code below, printing out 0 to the console, and then updating our counter's value by an addition of 1. In the next iteration, the updated value for I as 1 is checked if it's less than 10, which will also be true, and then the code below will be executed. So the same thing will happen in the next iterations, with the counter I's value updating every time until it accumulates to number 10, where the condition here would then say 10 is less than 10, which is false. Therefore the loop ends at this false condition. Awesome. So you can see how a while loop generates iterations. As long as its condition here is true, it will keep executing code inside the loops block. So let's make an infinite while loop. I'll set a bigger initial value for the counter I as 100, and then tweaking the condition here a bit with I greater than 10. Alright, when I run the program, you'll see that this while loop keeps iterating until no end. So just using the scroll bar here to show you the constant looping. Pretty crazy, huh? Yeah. And this is because our loop's condition will always have a true value. So looking at this from every iteration, the counter I will get updated with an addition of 1. So in the first loop, the condition will be true, with 100 greater than 10, executing the code below. And the next iteration will give a true condition, 101 greater than 10, so it will execute the code below here again, and move to the next iteration. And basically this condition here will always end up being some number greater than 10, therefore being a constant true condition. And our loop's iterations will never stop running, since it never comes across any false condition. So it loops on and on forever here. Sweet. To stop this loop, we have to apply a false condition to it, and we did that in the first example with I less than 10, where the iterations added I up to 10, giving a last condition as false, 10 less than 10. Alright. Funnily enough, this while loop is still running at the moment. We could have made this infinite loop in a simpler way, just by applying true here as the condition. So when I print this out, you'll see that the same numbers will keep getting printed out as a never-ending while loop. Pretty awesome. And if you were with me in the last tutorial on for loops, I mentioned a built-in keyword in Python that stops any loop from iterating, simply called break. So when I apply it here, the loop will stop at its first iteration. Running the program will show that the first I value is printed out, 100, since break is applied after printing I here, and the loop then ends at this iteration. So the counter update here, I plus equals 1, will be ignored, since it follows after break here, where the loop had ended. Awesome. So you may now have a general idea of how while loops work, and they are mostly used in programming tasks that require continuous iterations until a certain condition is met. In the case of for loops, they are used mostly for iterating over a defined range of values, so we'd have an idea of how many times a for loop will run. So I'll give you guys an example of the difference between the loops. Let's say I'd like to exercise with a skip rope, and maybe do 5 reps of jumping over the rope. This would then be an example of a for loop. since we know how many times we'd like to jump over the rope, with the condition that once we've done our 5th jump, we'll stop and take a break from jumping. Cool. Now if I wanted to just jump rope with no reps, maybe I'll stop jumping once I'm really tired. This would then be the case of a while loop, where I'll keep jumping over the rope until I've reached the exit condition, which will be when I'm finally exhausted from jumping. Awesome. So let's go through one more example. Say I'd like to print out numbers in reverse order from 9 to 1. I will first apply the starting value for the counter I as 9, and then changing the while condition to I is greater than 0, which will be followed by print I in the loops block, and the last code bit here will be changed to I minus equals 1. Regarding this piece of code, you've seen how we updated our counter with every iteration by adding 1 to it. In loop terms, I plus equals 1 here would be called incrementing a value. And now with I minus equals 1, we are decrementing the counter's value, or basically decreasing I's value by 1 per iteration, until we get a really small value at the end of the loop. So by running the program, you'll see a print of our numbers from 9 to 1, where the loop ends at the false condition 0 is greater than 0, given that I's value becomes 0 in the end after all the subtractions by 1 from the iterations. Awesome. One last thing to mention about while loops is that they can have their own else clause. So just like how you can use else conditions for for loops, you can execute one last thing after your while loop reaches a false condition or when it ends, and that is possible by using its else condition. So just putting a simple print statement, loop completed, for the else block. When I run the program, the same numbers are printed out, 9 to 0 here, followed by the loop completed statement as a response from the else condition, given that the while loop had ended. Sweet. And that's pretty much it on while loops. So I've covered a little bit about this loop and some examples here. There are some more interesting examples of using while loops, and I'll show some of these examples in a separate video later on. Alright, so that's all for today's video. In the next tutorials, you may see a lot of involvement of these loops and some new control flow statements. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, give it a like or a subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Asalamualaikum.